Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's Friday night, and my wife and I have just lit candles for Shabbat. We turn expectantly to our children to give them their Shabbat blessings, and they, in turn, play a game where they run away from us, forcing us to chase them down so we can place our hands on their heads and say the words that Jewish parents have said to their children every Friday night for generations. To our daughter, may God make you like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And to our son, may God make you like Ephraim and Menasseh. Why Ephraim and Menasseh? When there are plenty of other Jewish role models in the Torah, why not bless our sons to be like Moses and Aaron? Why not like the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What is the reason that I should have to chase down my son, and he's quite fast, by the way, to bless him to be like Ephraim and Menasseh? The seed of this tradition is found in our Torah portion, chapter 48, verse 20. At the moment when Jacob is blessing Joseph's two sons, his oldest Menasseh and his youngest Ephraim, Vayivarchem bayom hahu lemor becha yivarech Yisrael, lemor yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chi Menasseh v'yasem et Ephraim lifnei Menasseh. So he said to them on that day, through you shall Israel bless, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Menasseh. And he put Ephraim before Menasseh. Each Torah verse our rabbis teach can be understood on four levels, the acronym for which is Pardes, Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, roughly translated to the simple meaning, the hinted meaning, the expounded meaning, and the secret meaning. We're going to look at this verse and the blessing we give our children first in its simple meaning, and then work our way through these four levels of interpretation so we can explore the deeper implications of this verse. First, the pshat. The most basic reason we bless our sons that they should be like Ephraim and Menasseh is that we are upholding the promise Jacob made to Joseph in this verse. Through you shall Israel bless. That is to say, when parents come to bless their children, they will do so through Joseph and Joseph's offspring. Therefore, when we bless our sons to be like Ephraim and Menasseh, it is us doing our part to help Jacob fulfill his promise to Joseph. In a beautiful way, we are the embodied extension of this verse. Our blessing to our children is the fulfillment of Jacob's promise. The end of the book of Genesis is full of promises. Joseph promises to take Jacob's body back to Canaan for burial after his death, and he fulfills this promise. And Joseph places an oath on the next generation that they should take his bones to the land of Canaan when God takes them out of Egypt, a promise fulfilled by Moses. Jacob promises Joseph that Israel shall bless their generations through him and his children, a promise fulfilled by us and our children at the onset of every Shabbat. For the hinted meaning, I'll start by sharing what Rabbi Wolpe expanded on in his article in the Jerusalem Post. We bless our sons to be like Ephraim and Menasseh, especially because these are the only brothers who are not at odds with each other. From the very first set of siblings in the book of Genesis, we find a terrible track record. Cain kills Abel after God does not accept his own offering. Abraham leaves his family for something better. Isaac is estranged from Ishmael after Sarah kicks him out of the house. Esau desires to kill Jacob. After Jacob steals his blessing, Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery because of their banal jealousy, until finally we have two brothers in Israel who don't hate each other. And as Rabbi Wolpe points out, Menasseh especially, who was the firstborn, does not remonstrate when he is put second. This symbolizes our desire for our children to find peace in their friends and family, and to be happy with their lot, not jealous because their brother has something that they don't. Even Joseph is shocked when Jacob blesses the younger Ephraim first instead of his older son Menasseh. In verse 18, Joseph protests, "Not so, father, for this is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." Ephraim and Menasseh don't seem to mind. Let him bless the younger instead of the older. The protest comes from Joseph alone, while the brothers remain at peace with each other. Second, Rabbis Lawrence Kushner and Nehemiah Poland in My People's Prayer Book teach that this blessing represents the important bond that grandchildren can have with grandparents. While every other generational blessing up until this point in the book of Genesis has happened parent to child, Ephraim and Menasseh are blessed by their grandfather. This symbolizes the desire we have for our children to have an unmediated relationship with their ancestors, with grandparents alive today, as well as those who are no longer with us through the connecting power of Torah, mitzvot, traditions, and stories. Third, Ephraim and Menasseh are the first children of Israel to be born in exile. They're a symbol for ourselves and our generations that God is with us in exile, that we can survive, nay, even thrive when we cannot be in our homeland. We wish for our children to find blessing and success no matter the hardships that befall them, even in the most difficult and the most trying situations. To go a level further to the drash explanation of this verse, I want to turn to the Kedushat Levi, a rabbi we've been studying a lot in our Hasidut class on Saturday nights at 7 p.m. Shameless plug. He's an early Hasidic rabbi from the 18th century who shares an esoteric way we can think about this blessing. He teaches that the essence of the blessing to be like Ephraim and Menasseh is based on the meaning of their names. In chapter 41, Joseph named his oldest Menasseh, saying, Ki nashani Elohim et amali ve'et kol beit avi, meaning, God has made me forget all my hardships and all my father's household. Ephraim, his youngest, he named, saying, Ki hifrani Elohim be'eretz oni, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. His choice to name his children in this order makes sense in terms of the chronology of his story. First, he suffered hardships at the hand of his father's household, his brothers who left him to die in a pit and then sold him into slavery. And afterward, in a strange land, he rises to become fruitful and prosperous. His narrative is clear: suffering, then prosperity. The Kedushat Levi offers a different take on this narrative and begins by pointing to an obscure source from the Talmud. In Tractate Megillah, the Talmud writes that God is not like man. For people, first put a pot on the fire and then put water on it, whereas God puts water in it first and then puts the pot on the fire. This strange teaching, says the Kedushat Levi, tells us both why and how God brings suffering into the world. The pot is a symbol for mankind, the water is a symbol for chesed, for kindness and redemption, and the fire is the symbol for suffering. When people see their own suffering, they see it in a linear fashion, as Joseph did. First, there's fire, then there's water. First, there is suffering, then the healing, and in most cases, a deeper sense of appreciation for the basic gifts of life. To God, the water comes first, then the fire. God has in mind the healing and the spiritual growth when suffering is inflicted, even though we cannot see it. At the time, in God's eye, so to speak, the suffering is secondary to the ultimate healing and growth to come. Before continuing, I must say that this theology is not perfect, especially now with so much illness and pain in the world. To justify suffering at all, or to say that God has in mind from the outset some good that can come about from the suffering, can be troubling. Indeed, there is some suffering that's too painful to think about in these terms. But I want to finish the Kedushat Levi's teaching with the caveat that this theology is not perfect, because I think there's something important we can learn from it as we begin this new year. The Kedushat Levi teaches that this is why Ephraim is placed before Menasseh in the blessing. Even though Menasseh is older, his name connotes suffering, while Ephraim's name connotes blessing. Joseph sees his suffering in the typical human way, in a linear fashion, where suffering comes first, and then blessing can be discovered after the fact. Jacob wishes to teach Joseph and all Jews for generations to come that when God brings suffering, it's with the intention of the good that will ultimately come from it. For this reason, he puts Ephraim before Menasseh. He puts the child with the name that connotes blessing and prosperity before the one that connotes suffering, in order to teach us that the blessing to come is the initial intention. It is in God's mind before bringing about any suffering. He ends with a beautiful analogy. He says, when one has a small ceramic pot and wishes to make it larger, how does one do it? They have to smash it. And then one can take the shards and use them to make a larger vessel. This is how God relates to our suffering. It is God's desire to pour out blessing on the world and into each one of our lives, and we, like a small vessel, do not always have the capacity to hold the blessing that God wants us to have. Call these blessings wisdom, kind-heartedness, spiritual prosperity, to continue Rabbi Wolpe's metaphor from last week. So what does God do? Like a clay pot in the hands of the potter, God breaks us, but not out of malice, out of the desire that that vessel, our hearts and souls, should be larger to hold more water, that it should have a deeper capacity for gratitude and compassion and wisdom. Another popular and troubling theology is that God does not give us more than we can handle. This equally troubling theology from the Kedushat Levi goes in the face of that and says that God specifically gives us more than we can handle. And God does that in order to break us, so that when we are put back together, we have a deeper capacity for blessing than we ever had before, a deeper capacity for love than we ever had before. 2020 was an extremely hard year. And many of us find that as we enter this new year, we feel broken. I'd like to point out that the Kedushat Levi never mentions whose responsibility it is to put these shards back together. The opportunity to make a larger vessel is there, but who is the one who uses those broken pieces to make that larger pot? We have a choice in this new year, God willing, a year of healing and a year of rebuilding. Do we let the broken shards lay on the ground? Or do we pick them up and make ourselves vessels capable of receiving and giving more blessing to others? It's possible that this year will be difficult as well. And when troubles arise, what is our outlook? To Jews, suffering is never for suffering's sake. It means something. It builds something. Do we see our suffering like Joseph? Linear, waiting to see if there is a light at the end of the tunnel, or do we take refuge in the knowledge that God does not bring about darkness without the guarantee that there is light to come? I'll mention one more piece of our tradition as it relates to this. On Shabbat, we are forbidden from doing any malacha, a word traditionally translated as work. But in the Torah, the word malacha is only used for two specific kinds of work. One is in the book of Exodus and one is in the book of Genesis. In Exodus, the work of building the tabernacle in the wilderness, that is called melacha. However, the first time the word is ever used in the Torah is in Genesis chapter 1, in God's creating the world. On the seventh day of creation, Vayachal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa. God finished God's malacha, God's work, on the seventh day. Why do I tell you about malacha and its connection between the laws of Shabbat and God's creation of the world? And what does it have to do with the suffering we experience? One of the types of malacha that one cannot do on Shabbat is soter, breaking something with the intention to build it anew. Breaking for the purposes of destroying is just fine. But productive breaking, breaking something in order to make it anew, falls under the category of malacha. We learned from Genesis that God's actions in the world are called malacha, which means that any breaking God does is never for the sake of destruction alone, because breaking only in order to destroy, that is not malacha. when it comes to breaking, it is only melacha if there is an intention to rebuild that broken vessel. And for God, whose actions are called melacha, any breaking is by definition inseparable from the intention to build, to expand, to deepen, even and especially when it comes to human hearts. Ribono Shel Olam, bless us to put our broken shards together anew, so that we can receive and give more blessing than we have known before. Give us the strength to heal our broken hearts so we can love deeper, act wiser, and enter this new year with expanded compassion because of the troubles we have endured. And may you bless us like a loving parent to be like Ephraim and Menasseh. Shabbat Shalom. Our service continues with Enk Eloheinu. Take it away, Cantor Childs.
Thank you, Rabbi.